Well, hello, my name is SherriAnneDuffy-King, and I wrote this book about 15 years ago. It's titled The Title of a Crucified Innocence, and we are going to start off on Chapter 6 because the last video I did ended at the end of Chapter 5. Without further ado, here we go. Chapter 6, Who Am I? When Evie woke, her head was hurting and it felt as though it was going to implode. Her eyes were a bit blurry. As Evie pulled herself together and started to sit up, she reached her head up and felt something trickle down her forehead. Evie grazed her fingertips up against the liquid on her forehead gently and was in wonder at what it was. Then looked up and around to see her surroundings. The first thing Evie saw was a wide range of trees and forest. Evie looked to the ground behind where her head laid when she became conscious. There was a sharp rock with blood smeared around it. Taking a quick glance back at her fingertips and realizing it in a matter of seconds that it was her blood that was coming from the open wound, Evie moved her eyes up again and noticed that there was a steep hill and broken branches that led down it toward her still body. Knowing she had to get up and find her way to a nearby village or toward safety to get her wound tended. So when Evie stood up, dizzy, she was fighting dizziness. She had to figure out how to get out of the woods that looked all the same from all different directions. Proceeding to brush off her lavender dress and pull the filthy, sticky weeds out of her dark auburn hair, Evie chose and did so very quickly. Due northwest, or was it east? While Evie was walking, she had to figure out what her name was, and fast, to keep people's suspicions from rising. Evie's memory started to become clearer little by little. Right out of the blue, she picked a name. It was more of an estimation. Her name from now on was to be Evie, until she could figure out who she really was. The more Evie tried to think about it, her head was sent reeling with heavy thudding. Her name wasn't going to be enough. If they asked her about her last name or where she came from, Evie wouldn't have an answer. Evie hummed to herself while in concentrated thought. Chapter 7, Admirable Rescue. While Evie was contemplating her current issue, she almost tripped on a rock near a pathway or road made of rocks and stones. Looking left then right, Evie decided to cross. When getting in the middle of the road, Evie could hear and feel the ground shaking and horses squealing. Then a "Yah!" echoed to her. All Evie could do was freak out, standing there as still as a stone as the carriage came closer to her, having only a fraction of a second to get out of the way or become as flat as a stone in the pathway beneath her feet. Then suddenly out of nowhere a dark cloaked figure plucked Evie out of the road where the carriage would have flattened her into morning porridge, placing Evie on the back of the saddled black stallion, saying nothing to her. Chapter 8, Orientations for Fools. The ride was bumpy and made Evie jittery to the point she felt nauseous. It seemed like an eternity looking around to catch her breath and glance in her surroundings. They soon stopped near a waterfall that the very glimpse of it made Evie shudder. It was the most breathtaking natural monument she had ever seen. The figure hopped off of the sturdy old black stallion, then jumped up to help Evie off by the waist. Thinking if she got a good glimpse of her rescuer, then she would be able to give a proper thank you. After setting Evie down on the ground, the cloaked figure pulled off the hooded attire which covered who he really was. Evie's jaw dropped and all she could get out of her mouth was a whimper. He looked at Evie with emerald eyes and gave off a coy little smile, and said with an accent so strong, Evie felt every bit of her body melt. "Are you okay, miss? What is your name, lass?" Evie shuddered and realized she was being acknowledged. Her cheeks were aflame as she blushed with embarrassment and her hands started to sweat. Then Evie said, "Yeah, yes, I'm fine. Thank you so much, dear sir, for saving my life from that horrid carriage. My name is Evie." He looked at Evie with a cool contempt, then proceeded with the questions. "Where do you hail from, Lady Evie?" With a nervous glance back to his angelic face. "I'm not sure," Evie said. That was all that Evie could muster her energy to whisper. Evie desperately hoped he wouldn't ask any more questions. He pulled all his strength together not to ask many questions, because he was a man who rather liked small talk and dreaded the long, boring conversation, even though it killed him inside to restrain from touching her creamy white flesh and holding her lovingly. Then slightly he tried to pronounce his name so that the lady could understand him through his strong, unrecognizably thick accent and get his name right. "M'lady, the name's Aidan McTavish." He turned away from Evie and started to walk fast into the abyss of the forest. As he left Evie, thought to herself that then he turned away from Evie and started to walk fast into the abyss of the forest. As he left, Evie thought to herself, then began to build camp and gather wood for the fire. For a while, Evie pondered a thought on why his accent seemed so lush and familiar. Flickers of her life back home coursed through her thoughts. His accent was a borderline between Scottish and Irish. When their eyes met before, she felt a click, a belonging. Her thoughts were muddled. She felt like she had met him before on unknown circumstances. A preposterous idea, but nonetheless she reveled in it. Chapter 9. Unscheduled Disasters. It didn't take long to figure out Evie had no food to cook or satisfy her stomach's endless growling. Then it dawned on her. Why would anybody live in these woods? There hasn't been an ounce of food anywhere since Evie's been introduced to the cold, harsh temperatures of the outdoors. As soon as Evie was done putting up the tent, she heard hard footfalls echoing through the little camp area, coming toward the tent. A thought crept up on her through the shivers of her spine. What if those footfalls weren't that nice, handsome gentleman who had just a few hours ago rescued her from that runaway carriage? What if it were someone entirely different trying to raid the supplies and bring Evie harm? That's when Evie had to think and do so very quickly. Turning to see what was surrounding her in the tent, Evie's eyes bounced from object to object as her heart raced. Then Evie found something that could be of some use to her. A fire poker? Not very scary, but enough to stun the intruding attacker so that Evie could make a run for it and pray that her rescuer would lend a helping hand to her second escape. Evie reached for the object, but was too late. Suddenly, Evie was spun around so fast that her head was trying to catch up. When it finally caught up, Evie soon realized what was going on. Evie was wrapped in someone's arms and on the dirt floor being wrestled. Evie couldn't believe what was happening, was at a total struggle to get unhandled. Evie then saw a tall, dark, shadowy figure off of one of the tent walls. Thunk! Evie began to get dizzy with lack of oxygen. Her eyelids began to weigh her face down, and she was out. Chapter 10. Frights Go Bump. The dream Evie was thrust into was weird, although she's had many. Couldn't quite remember them all. But this one was embedded in her cranium. It was dark and hazy, with a castle in the white outskirts of it. Yet someone would be calling her name from a high tower above the clouds. Their voice was muffled and their face was a big blur. From what Evie could tell, it was a man reaching for her, and the sky going pitch black with eccentric colors not found anywhere Evie's ever seen or been. Chapter 11, Dreams of Waking Love. When Evie awoke, she could smell an unrecognizable fragrance burning. Her eyes were yet again blurry, but soon adjusted. She could hear someone chanting, a voice Evie has never heard. Beginning to sit up, but when Evie tries, her side begins to burn and ache. Once again, she's puzzled about her whereabouts. The room is dark with only one small chamber door, having a warm kind of cozy feeling about it. Behind the stunning door, Evie could hear rough footfalls coming toward the room she was laid up in. They were quick and fast-paced. The person coming toward Evie was breathing so heavy that the breathing almost sounded inhuman. The door cracked and the figure stepped inside the dark and musky room. Evie's jaw dropped as she immediately recognized the guest. It was Aiden, her earlier rescuer. Aiden McTavish. His smile was reassuring as it lit up his face as he spotted Evie acknowledging his very adventurous presence. When he smiled, a jolt of heat rushed through Evie's veins and her cheeks flustered as red as blood on snow. Aiden walked with elegance and adventure in each and every wondrous step, bent low and placed his left hand on the nape of Evie's neck and his right hand on her lower back, lifting her closer to his heated body, his emerald eyes sizzling with passion. Reaching his tender lips down on Evie's, a jolt of electricity unlocked a secret barrier surrounding her placid heart, all while making her knees go weak. The kiss was soft and full of vigorous passion, making Evie feel as if she was about to swoon. All that surrounded them began to fade and swirl. Without hesitation, her arms reached up, cradling his neck, pulling him closer, his chest sitting firm and warm against Evie's bosoms. Their hearts beating as one, Evie's hair dangling through his muscular fingers down her back. Evie suddenly felt lightheaded and their bodies began to float, lighter than being on a sweet summer rain cloud in the breeze. Another jolt of electricity and everything that Evie clung to gets ripped from her grasps. Chapter 12, Untidy Events. The cage Evie awakes in. The cage Evie awoke. Cage Evie awake like someone poured icy cold aqua on her. Beneath the poorly built cage trotted across steep crevices on a trail of earth and sharp pebbly gravel. Evie's surroundings startled her. Sliding up to a sitting position, the lavender gown Evie was wearing torn to shredded ribbons, barely covering her modest, ample body. Evie's hair frazzled and contorted in webs to descending her scalp, dried blood seeping crusty past them with her neck, where a cold sweat remoistened it, and it dampened the shredded gown, sitting comfortably on Evie's sweaty curves like sticky honey from bees. Closing her eyelids, resting her fingertips on her forehead, slowly fumbling down her eye sockets, holding her hands firmly yet steady, covering her face. Where am I now? Pushing her hands up again to slide the loose strands of hair out of her face and behind her scalp. Glancing around the empty space between Evie and the bars, the floor must have been constructed out of dirt, wood paneling, rotted-out bars, and last but not least, a dirty brown rug of some sort with multitude of stains. The corner opposite of Evie, a metallic dish bowl full of muddy liquid Evie assumes was water. Looking at her hands, finally noticing the weight of the jingling chains wrapped around Evie's bleeding wrists, the links entangled in a web descending her ankles, and then toward a set of bars above the dish bowl. Hide of some animals wrapped around the outer area of the bars, barely letting any light in from the sunny outdoors. Hide of some animals wrapped around the outer area of the bars, barely letting any light in from the sunny outdoors. Knowing that seeing the outside was inevitable, feeling a comforting breeze was wishful thinking as the leaves of wild oaks and field of yellow vegetations giggled as the wind tickled by. Knowing Evie would never escape to see her brother Ashton or their home ever again, the recognizable feeling Evie came to acknowledge as everyday chitter. Doubt, fearing her hopes, dashed down to being lost and alone, to feeling numb and paranoid with fear. A sudden halt dragged the wagon to a stop, thwarting Evie into the bars, making her head burn with a stinging rage that blurred her eyes until tears drenched her face. Peeking out of one of the slits on the animal hide, the outer area felt darker, and felt like death had conquered all, resting in his new home. The clouds darkened over the hazy sun as it dipped fervently behind moss-covered hills and oaks soaking with dew in the distance, relinquishing a dark blanket of soft stars and rigidly dangerous clouds, even the moon hidden bright. The cage jolted a couple of times as a muscular man diddled and cursed at the knots and locks on the cage. He wore a loincloth, his hair so black it gave off a shimmering blue tint. Sorry, I had to stop for a second. Someone sitting next to me passed gas. I apologize. Threw me off my game. Okay. Let me start over to where I was at. The cage jolted a couple of times as a thin, muscular man diddled and cursed at the knots and locks on the cage. He wore a loincloth, his hair so black it gave off a shimmering blue tint, relaxing on his lower, darkened back. His eyes were fierce like a hawk's, dark and menacing like empty space, coyly tame at certain times like a king of lions. After the locks and knots finally let loose, he gave off a sigh of relief. His muscles tensed as he slid the cage door open, grabbing the links to Evie's chain and pulling ferociously. Now falling forward out of the back of the wagon's end, she almost nosedived onto her face inches from the dirt. His arms caught Evie in a warm embrace. She almost felt safe if not for the chains, blood, headache, and cage. Okay? Setting Evie down on the ground, he began to examine her with eyes intent on examining his prized victim. Before moving his arms completely, his hand slid down Evie's back and over her firm bottom, resting on her outer thighs, making Evie feel uncomfortable. Bending Evie sideways as if trying to kiss her at the end of a slow dance, lifting her right thigh against his bare-skinned leg, up his waist as his fingers caressed in a circular motion, rising a powerful sensation, tingling up her dingy peach-colored arms. Evie's visions showed sparks as she let them explode inside of her corneas. After a few seconds, Evie was thinking he was going to do something truly savage. Rip! Evie's gown cries echoed through the empty air. Taking a huge chunk from her gown, he placed it over her eyes, spinning Evie around so that her arched back faced him. After tying the wilted material, placing his hands on her shoulders, pulling her back closer to his heated body, sliding his palms down her forearm, past her gilded wrists, over her knuckles to the chains. A groan escaped his parted lips, reaching Evie's ears. Holding that pose for a moment longer, spinning Evie around once again, dragging her behind him like a dog on a leash, pulling her along a yard or two. Stopping to swiftly pick Evie up so that she wouldn't delay his patience. His arms were warm and tight. Her head felt a bit groggy and heavy on her shoulders. All Evie could do was lie her head back and wait until they stopped and she'd get some answers, no matter how frightening they might be. When her head made contact with his chest, a groan, silent but rumbling, burrowed from his chest to his lips as he tried to hide it with a cough. They must have been on stairs because the ride was bumpy. Lightning scattered over the rigid clouds, letting rain begin to pour heavily. When reaching the top of the stairs, he sat Evie down. As her feet hit the ground, a thunderous lightning bolt hit between them. Evie wasn't sure which she was more afraid of, the man or the etched hairs climbing up her back. Knowing Evie couldn't see never stopped her from making a run for it. As Evie was running from shock, she couldn't hear the footfalls closing in the distance behind her. In the next moment a hand grasped a huge chunk of Evie's hair and yanked her back into locked arms. Evie thought hard about resisting. In the end, she knew she chose the right decision. Heart racing, water drenched Evie like a moist sheet. Rain washed away the sweaty heat pounding away from every pore on her life form. Evie wasn't sure if the man holding her was the same one who dragged her up the stairs. While they were standing there, another set of feet started to walk toward Evie from behind, then passing fervently, splashing through the little puddles. As they got a couple of feet in front of her, they turned and walked 2 or more steps and then stopped. A jingling sound came from the halted person. Then he wrestled with a solid object she assumed was a keyhole and keys. After a few seconds, the sound stopped and the door was cracked open. The creak was so eerie, Evie began to get flashbacks of an empty, foggy, lonely place that somehow brought tears to her eyes. Guiding Evie through the misty archway and down a shaft full of rigid, rugged stairs, the cement stairs turned in a circular motion. Water seeped from the ceiling in cracks, lulling down the walls and stairs, leaving tiny rushing rivers from little puddles. Every few steps down, a flash of lighted torch hanging from the wall lit a small path. Steam sizzled as water dripped carelessly onto them. Evie's nose itched and tickled as her hairs in her nose sucked in a puff full from the stench of death and heavy smoked meat swelling up her lungs through her outstretched nostrils, leaving her coughing and breathless. At the last step they stopped. The man behind Evie began to untie the blindfold. When it slid away from her eyes, a heavy glaring haze replaced darkness. Ahead of Evie lay a door frame with the door wide open. On the other side of the corridor, the floor was cement and the wood paneling covered the windows. Let a glare blind her vision until she could bear it no longer and looked away. The floor was cold as chilling ice. The sun beating on Evie's form was comforting, rushing chills away from her, filling her with warmth in a self of righteousness. As Evie's spirit started to rise, the men behind her pushed her to move forward. Chapter 13. Unplanned Events. At the end of the blinding hall, a throne emerged in black, shimmering steel. Billions of rays from the window bounced off of it, making it look like a god sat between its grasps. On each side of the throne hung banners of licorice red and gold trim. Black engulfed the center, leaving the shadow outline of a sword. On the floor, under the licorice banner, stood dozens of candles on each side of the poles. Stairs leading up to a throne were also black as night, with the gold and red trimming, the threads soft as camel silk and ancient as dinosaur fossils. Lining the walls were men who were dressed in black balloon-shaped drawers similar to Sarok Malutra's men. That memory came to Evie quickly like a dream. The only difference was the color of the bottoms and the fierce eyes and rigid faces full of war and hate. The corridor was a yard long. Every footstep felt awful and horribly embarrassing, like Evie was walking down death row to the gallows. The man on the throne had tinted flames for hair, not yellow and not red, but a sandy beige, wild and untamed. His face was solid, full of confinement. His eyes as blue as ice, skin tan and rugged like smooth leather silk. The whole time Evie was being guided toward him, she had a dagger at her back. He never moved his eyes off her. He was leaning on his left elbow and wiggling his fingers in the air for the surf to come to him. When he spoke, it was in hushed tones. Then he waved the young woman away, sending her to do his biddings. He stayed in that same position until Evie arrived at his feet to share an audience with him. Evie did not speak for fear that he would bring his wrath down upon her and have her executed. When he spoke, the tone of his words were crueler than his icy eyes. "Ah, I have heard so much about you, Evie, that I begin to think you were merely a redundant myth." While scooting closer to the edge of his throne, he looked more dazzling, like a creature who couldn't be tamed. "I wonder if you know the prophecy, with you by my side we will fulfill it, and Enbala shall be mine." With that he jumped off of the top of the stairs and grabbed Evie by the back of the neck, pulling her closer to his parted lips and his bare chest. His heart beat with a sense of control, and hers racing like a captured animal. Evie's gilded wrist kept her a small distance from being totally consumed by his possessive embrace. The kiss was warm, but also savage. His grip on her ceased. Sliding his hands to Evie's shoulders, he pushed her back into the arms of soldiers. "Take her to her chambers and get her ready for our wedding." With that, Evie was led to her chambers with such force that her mind was shaken up, full of confusion. Chapter 14, Dreams Gone Awry. The chamber door slammed shut with such conviction it almost knocked Evie off of her feet. Looking around, Evie could see 3 pieces of furniture lay in the chamber: a mirror, a standing stool, and a table with drawers. On the table sat a bunch of fine silks as white as spring clouds. Needles poked out of a stuffed red ball as string led a tangling journey across the desk, weaving its way like a winding stone path. The mirror was shimmering as the sun came through the windows, and birds began to chirp. This place seemed so odd, so strange. When Evie was outside, it was pouring so awful she almost believed she was in the era of Noah and his magnanimous ark. As Evie sat gaping out the parted curtains, the sun was out in bloom, shining. Evie didn't notice at first glance, but by this angle, Evie could see why it was so bright. There were 2 suns. The castle was black as burning coals. There were no plants in the courtyard, only bare dirt and gravel. A musky scent came rushing past Evie into the chamber. The smell was the best thing to happen to her since her luck turned to crumbles, leaving her hanging in empty sorrow. The smell was a mix between ivy and lavender. While Evie was glaring out the perched window in the tower, Evie barely noticed that someone had entered. Out of the corner of Evie's eyes, she could see them standing at the table, rustling with the material. And when Evie turned around, it was the serf from earlier, who was given orders by the sire. She was pretty and really young, not much older than the age of 16. Her hair was sparkling blonde and pulled back into a loose bun that had some tresses falling out. Her eyes were muddy brown. Her facial expression was sullen. She walked with grace and great patience in her gray gown. When she noticed Evie was watching her, she walked over to Evie, her back immensely straight, taking in long strides. When she reached Evie, she said not a word and grabbed Evie's hand and began to pull Evie to the standing stool across the room. Birds twittered in the distance. Evie stepped up onto the stool and waited for further instructions and body language, so Evie would know what to do next. She turned and grabbed a large pair of cutting shears and walked to Evie, watching Evie for a split second, then went around her back and began to cut a chunk off of the bottom of Evie's gown, cutting upward, releasing Evie's dress from its sweaty grasps, leaving it lifeless and dead as the wilted material descended toward the floor. As it fell, Evie watched as her naked body was revealed. It must have been a long time since seeing Evie's body, because Evie was dirty and bruises covered her. Evie's side that always ached was black and royal blue as a hideous war wound. The blood coming from Evie's head was still seeping. The chains that bound Evie were drenched in blood. While she was working around the dress, she pulled the key out from her apron, and that would release Evie. The key was familiar. It had a lavender ribbon entwined in the bottom of the skeleton key. She walked to the front of Evy and began to unchain Evy, finishing up Evy's last ankle. Evy's muscles were aching as Evy rushed back to them. With a clank, they fell effortlessly onto the floor. Then she grabbed the cloth on the table and unraveled it. To Evy's dismay, it was a silky white and golden robe. After it was fully secure, hiding her modest body, she walked to the chamber door, knocked on it, then behind the door came a clanging sound, all too recognizable door being released from its archway. The woman moved to the side as three men entered, one with a tub and the others with buckets of steaming hot water the size of their torsos. They glided as if weight didn't matter in their world, only to stop in the center near where Evy stood. They sat the stuff down with little effort on their part. Then they left without a word. When the chamber door shut behind them, the door let off a locking sound, ensuring that Evy wouldn't be able to escape. She turned and then started walking too briskly towards Evy. When she arrived at her stopping spot, she pulled a sponge out from behind her back and gave off a coy little smile. When she smiled, she had no teeth and no tongue. It was completely severed off. Without hesitation, Evy stepped into the piping hot water, tipping her toe in first to test the temperature. At first the water was so hot it felt as cold as ice water. But then the steam brought on the redness to Evy's ankles, and the heat coursed up Evy's legs and her back. It was too hot for Evy to bear. She began to hop back out when she saw that the woman staring at her with flames and cursing her muddy brown eyes. The dagger pointed right at her. Her head shook left and then right a couple of times before she lipped, "Get in." Pointing the dagger menacingly at the tub, so Evy stayed and bared the hot water, because Evy would rather face heat burning her flesh than having a woman stick that horrible dagger in Evy's back. When Evy sat down and the woman walked over to the table and set the dagger down to retrieve some bath oils and a recent sponge, having them, she slid toward the tub Evy was in and began to mix the oils and water and the sponge, making bubbles that smelled of French lavender and a hint of white wine. She wasn't as gentle as Evy had hoped for. The woman scrubbed Evy's aching skin, leaving more bruises and cracks. Trying to put off the pain, Evy began to daydream. Then Evy's mind went blank. Everything became as white as milk. All thoughts and events came rushing back to Evy. The first thing that came back to was Evy's brother, Ashton, and home. Aiden was the last thing that crept through Evy's mind, leaving her with small kisses and romantic embraces in Evy's fantasy. A yank and the woman was behind Evy, trying to undo Evy's tangly mess of hair descending her scalp, leaving her more frazzled hairs than Evy thought she had to begin with. After those torturous moments, she nudged Evy to get up and out of the water. So Evy did. Evy stood feeling water cascade off of every crevice and bump on her body, making her feel like an original waterfall. Hot water steaming off of Evy until the woman wrapped the robe around Evy again to cover up the bruises and Evy's modest innocence. Evy glanced up once more to the decorative mirror and saw that her hair was pulled back in a bun and her bruises became less clear. Evy's eyes were weary and full of dread, and her complexion was horrible. Even though Evy felt no hope, the woman in the mirror showed her that she was hope. Surviving was all that Evy has to best in her hopes of finding her brother. Standing there and waiting for the orders from Evy's unfortunate new friend with no voice. When Evy received no orders of what to do, Evy looked at the woman. Her back was turned to Evy as she shuffled through the material on the table. Then her head raised and she spun around, too quick for Evy to question her sudden change of heart. In her hands was a dress made of the same material as the robe, white silk with golden trim and a neckline that showed off Evy's bosoms very well. Evy put it on and hoped the woman wouldn't get angry enough at Evy to toss her out the window half naked. The dress fit without needing to be measured. After that she had Evy put on matching slippers made of the same material and sat Evy down on the stepping stool and began to mess with her hair and put it up in pearl clips, and then the woman added a necklace and earrings that matched. Evy watched her work fervently, and in her working was like watching a genius. She was careful and cautious on how she made Evy's hair look. By the time she was done, Evy's hair was magnanimous. It was fashioned in a braided bun, with one single long curl trailing the nape of Evy's neck down her lower back. Evy's bangs were beautiful and shine like she never seen them shine. When Evy stood up, looking into the mirror in wonder, the woman pulled back and grabbed the dagger as if Evy was about to attack her, even though Evy wasn't. Evy's auburn hair glimmered and set off a smile that Evy could not hide. She looked beautiful. While Evy was looking into the mirror, Evy noticed that the woman was still staring at Evy, so Evy tried to hide her smile, but it only made her eyes light up even more and her cheeks go even redder. Evy put her hands over her gaping mouth and felt her lips close ever so slightly. As Evy was staring off into the empty space of the mirror, realization hit her smack dab in the forehead. I'm being forced into marriage by some savage king. How am I going to get out of this one? Not knowing Evy said that out loud, the woman had looked shocked by this information that seeped from Evy's challenged brain. While Evy was daydreaming and she said those things, Evy had no idea that there was another person present in the chamber. Evy followed the woman's gaze. He's toward the door. Evy followed the woman's gaze toward the door and found Sire Iola standing there with shock and anger written all over his face. He did another sign to the lady with his hands, and she looked down and rushed out as if she would rather be somewhere else. She shut the chamber door behind her. When the locking sound ceased, he stepped forward. Still upset, he began to pace left and right consistently. Then he stopped and turned back toward Evy, sun melting off of his face, leaving shadows etched in his rugged lines. Before anger could consume all of him, and a glimmer of passion filled his eyes. After a second of stalling, Evy glanced back at the mirror, not realizing that he moved so quick it sent shivers up Evy's spine. He moved behind Evy in a blink of an eye, grabbing Evy by her throat, pulling her closer to his strong chest. All Evy could do was watch as his eyes lit like flames. An angry groan rumbled from his diaphragm, whispering full of passion. Savage I am. We'll see how savage you think I am tonight when I have you all to myself. Evy whimpered and tears streaked her face as Evy could no longer hide her true colors. He glanced from the side of Evy's cheeks to the mirror she was staring into, and compassion filled his eyes as he sat Evy down and fled out the locked door.